Morning as we introduce Senate Bill 268. This is a critical piece of legislation that is long overdue, decades overdue. I would like to thank the Problem Solvers Caucus and my many co-authors for their ongoing support, several of the members you see here standing with us today. I'd also like to thank the Placer County District Attorney, Morgan Geyer, for his support, his mentorship, and to the women that are here as witnesses to the impact of our law being oblivious to our legislators. They are warriors, they are survivors, and they are women who have a story to tell. Tanya Baldwin and Catherine Grayson, thank you so much for being here today to tell your stories. I want to acknowledge that we have more survivors here with us today in support of Senate Bill 268. Annabelle Velasquez, Barbara Kelly, thank you for being here. And as the author of this legislation, I stand before you also as a survivor. Today is April 24th. It holds a great significance, not just because we are spotlighting this great Senate Bill 268, but because it's also Denim Day. Here in the Capitol during Sexual Assault Awareness Month, we must remember the importance of our collective action in fighting against sexual violence. Denim Day is the day where we wear denim not as a fashion statement, but as a symbol of solidarity, a tangible expression of our commitment to challenge the myths and misconceptions that perpetrate rape culture. It's fitting on this day of awareness that we shine a spotlight on Senate Bill 268 to reclassify the rape of an unconscious person who is intentionally drugged as a violent felony. I'd like to share some statistics with you. 1 in 6 women in the U.S. are victims of rape. Over 14,000 rapes were reported here in California between 2021 and 2022. And less than 2,000 of those rapes led to an arrest. Less than 1% of rapes and attempted rapes end with a felony conviction for the perpetrator. And we know that perpetrators offend again and again and again unless they're held responsible for their decisions. I want to be clear that rape is a violent act, regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. And yet, our current laws fail to reflect that truth. They fall short in addressing the horrific nature of rape when a victim is unable to give consent. Now, Proposition 57 is one of our greatest failures. It's allowed criminals who've been convicted of, quote, nonviolent crimes to be eligible for early release, including those convicted of raping an incapacitated person. So imagine the horror of waking up and realizing that you've been violated, that your body has been entered into, and you have been unable to defend yourself, and you could not resist. Now imagine the added indignity of knowing that under the current laws here in California, your perpetrator will more than likely receive a lesser punishment, allowing them to reoffend simply because you are incapacitated. This is unacceptable, and it's a betrayal of justice and a betrayal of our duty to protect the most vulnerable among us. We cannot continue to underpunish perpetrators and allow these perpetrators to be on the streets. The rights of survivors who are sexually assaulted while incapacitated must be prioritized and protected, not the other way around. We cannot be a pro-criminal state. We must keep survivors and victims at the forefront. With Senate Bill 268, we have the opportunity to fix this dangerous loophole and ensure that survivors are not re-victimized by a legal system that fails to recognize the gravity of their trauma. We have several speakers with us here today, some of our co-authors from the Assembly. Senate Bill 268 is in the Assembly Public Safety Committee and will be evaluated here in the next few months. In order for it to be signed by the governor, it must clear the Assembly. We have our DAs from several from our district, Senate District 4, our survivors, and a very special guest, Treasurer Fiona Ma, to join us here today. So I will allow our speakers to come forward, give their testimony before we wrap up here today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Juan Alanis. I'm the Assembly member representing District 22 in the Central Valley. I'm a proud co-author of SB 268, also a very good friend of the senator's, colleague, teammate, and also problem solvers. This bill is a bipartisan and bicameral measure that will be a huge victory for crimes of victims in California. And as mentioned earlier, for too long we have been basically catering to criminals and not keeping victims in mind. As the Vice Chair of the Assembly Public Safety Committee, one of my top priorities is to support legislation that benefits victims and not criminals. SB 268 is a common sense legislation that would make it a violent felony to sexually assault an intoxicated victim. And who would have thought that we did not have that on the books? I'm sure some of you today may have not known that and are in shock. When someone takes advantage of an impaired person for any reason, a person who likely cannot defend themselves, as mentioned earlier, this should be a violent felony. I'm very proud again to be a co-author on this bill. I want to thank you. Big thank you to my colleague from Jackson, Senator, who's behind me, for the lead on such an important issue and for standing for victims of this horrific crime that this bill will cover. I want to thank you, and again, it's an honor to be up here to speak with you, and I look forward to seeing this bill getting passed by the governor or signed by the governor. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here today. My name is Assemblywoman Lori Davies, and I have the honor of representing the 74th Assembly District, which encompasses Orange and San Diego counties. I want to be brief in my remarks and say that when I discuss this measure with my constituents, they're not only appalled it is not a current law, but agree it is well past time we bring justice for thousands of victims who have had to endure atrocious acts. When someone has been drugged or consumed too much alcohol, they are in an impaired state and oftentimes do pass out due to the effects of their body. These people are in a vulnerable place, and anyone who takes advantage of them in such a heinous way absolutely deserves to have the hammer brought down on them in our justice system. I am proud to be a co-author of this measure, and I wholeheartedly urge members of the Assembly Public Safety Committee to pass this bill when it gets set for a hearing later this year. I want to thank the author for her work on this issue and look forward to hopefully seeing it passed. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Assemblywoman Blanca Rubio. I represent the 48th Assembly District, which is the East San Gabriel Valley in Southern California. I'm also the chair of the Select Committee on Domestic Violence in the Assembly. I would first and foremost like to thank my colleagues here today, especially Senator Alvarado Gil, for both their time and attention directed towards addressing this heinous crime. The creation, support, and implementation of this bill is long overdue. We cannot turn the blind eye to any kind of physical violence, let alone the circumstances which this bill looks to address. Current law only emboldens perpetrators and leaves victims disempowered and further unprotected in an unjust and imbalanced system. I am proud to know my colleagues here have continuously advocated to protect our most vulnerable community members, women, people of color, and those predisposed to an abuse of power and circumstance, especially while under the influence. I once again want to thank Senator Alvarado Gil for having me here and allowing me to co-author this important piece of legislation. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Morgan Geyer. I'm the Placer County District Attorney. I'd like to thank Senator Alvarado Gil for this bill. The sexual assault of someone who has been drugged or is intoxicated is a violent offense. It is violent in the minds of our community members, it is violent in the minds of the victims, and it needs to be considered violent in our penal code. This is common sense legislation, and I hope and will urge the legislature to pass this bill. Victims of sexual violence deserve this, and we demand it. Thank you very much.
I just want to say how difficult it is for one to tell their story. And I've been telling my story as a survivor of sexual assault for over 20 years. And the statistics have gone up and the laws have changed very little. With us today, we are going to be hearing from survivor Kathryn Grayson and then Tanya Baldwin.
Well, thank you, Senator Alvarado Gil, for your work on this bill and for the opportunity to speak today. I want to start, well, first, my name is Kathryn Grayson. I want to start by saying that, like all of you, I am a lot of things. I am a CFO at the nonprofit Without Permission, where we're working to end sex trafficking and help those victimized by it. I'm an educated person. I have a master's degree in psychology. I did my bachelor's degree in philosophy at UC Berkeley. I am the very proud mother of two fantastic young men. One is serving on submarines in the Navy, and the other is in his first year at the Air Force Academy. But before all of that, alongside all of that, and really underneath it, I am a rape survivor. I say underneath not because surviving this crime is somehow the most defining fact about me, but rather because the trauma of what I experienced has lived underneath the surface of my life, inside my body, like an invisible wound through all of it. For decades, it was a place of fear and shame that drained my joy and haunted me quietly while I studied and parented and tried to find my place in this world. I was 21 when I met a guy at a concert. He seemed nice and smart, and he said he liked to cook. He lived on a houseboat. I was intrigued. I gave him my phone number, and we went to lunch a few times. Then he invited me over to his house so he could cook me dinner. It seemed like a dream date. I arrived, and we went out on his porch over the water. He offered me a beer. I remember him handing it to me. And I remember chatting a bit while I drank no more than half the beer. And then suddenly I really didn't feel good. I told him so, and he popped up out of his chair, took me by the hand. He said something like, "Maybe you need to lie down." He didn't seem surprised or concerned in the least. He walked me through the houseboat to his bedroom, and I fell onto the bed. My memories after that are a blur. The closest experience I've had since is sleep paralysis, where I was half awake but unable to move. I was aware he was having sex with my body, but I couldn't do anything about it. I couldn't speak. I tried just to turn my head, but movement was impossible. My vision blurred. I had moments where I could see him on top of me, moving. I was numb. I was immobilized. I was totally confused, and I was horrified. I have no idea how long that went on. But I awoke before dawn with a voice screaming at me in my head, "Get out of this house, get out of here right now." I was instinctively terrified of him. I grabbed my clothes and got dressed as fast as I could and as quietly as I could. When I was out of the house and sure I was out of earshot, I started running. I called a friend on the way home and said, "I think I was raped last night." To which she replied, "Well, you went over to his house alone. What did you expect?" I knew that was a bad idea. That was the 90s, and back then date rape was barely a concept to me. The standard of enthusiastic consent didn't exist in my mind, and the possibility that someone would intentionally drug me wasn't even on my radar. It seemed at the time like the responsibility was mine to make sure unwanted sex didn't happen, either by the way I dressed or talked or whether I went to a boy's house for dinner or not. I had failed to prevent this from happening, so the shame was mine. This is why I didn't speak of what had happened for a long time. Fast forward 20 years to 2015 when Brock Turner raped an unconscious girl behind a dumpster. That was the first time I heard the world talking seriously and publicly about consent. That is when my healing began. From that conversation, I learned that a woman is not by default available for sex unless she says no or fights you off enough. I heard women loudly saying, "You cannot do what you want to us just because we're drunk or unable to resist." And for the first time, I was able to see clearly what had happened. I had been raped. I'd been drugged out of my mind and then raped by a person who was willing to risk my very life in order to take his pleasure from my body. unimpeded by my personhood or my free will. Rape is an inherently violent act. It's a crime of deep violation with long-term repercussions for the rest of the victim's life. It turns the victim's own body and sexuality into a battleground. It leaves us to put back together shattered pieces of what could have been and should have been a joyful part of having a body and enjoying intimacy. It can take a really long time to heal. I have spent years working with rage and grief and the accumulated pain of decades spent feeling fundamentally powerless despite everything I accomplished. And the blame here belongs entirely to rapists, and also to an enabling culture that has shown very little will to stop them. No wonder I felt the only choice I had was to bury my trauma and blame myself. And as a result, a rapist walked free, empowered to do it again if he so chose. Passing SB 268 is another step toward creating an environment in California that protects victims and appropriately calls drugging and raping someone what it is: violent. If I had woken up that morning knowing what I know now, and if SB 268 was in place and public knowledge, if I lived in a world where I trusted law enforcement to have believed me, be upset for me, fight for me, I'd have gone straight to the police. They might have been able to get to his house before anything was destroyed, collect enough evidence, and prosecute him for his crime. At the very least, I would have processed the experience in a very different and much more empowering way. And at best, he'd have gone to jail for a long time and been prevented from harming others. And I have to believe that if everyone knew there would be a swift and coordinated response to this crime every time, we would see a lot less of it. I look forward to that day when rape is an unthinkable and uncommon crime, a day when we are consistent and committed in our enforcement of sexual assault laws, a day when our cultural intolerance of sexual violence in all its forms and our rapid, collective, protective response to it makes our country safe for all people, including 21-year-old girls who just want to go on a date. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Tanya Baldwin. In 1996, when I was just 23 years old, I was drugged to the point of unconsciousness by Andrew Lester, who would later become known as an infamous serial rapist. The woman standing here with me today is Barbara Kelly, another one of many survivors who was intentionally drugged and raped by him. We just met each other for the first time 2 weeks ago, and today we are using our collective voice to tell you why Senate Bill 268 is desperately needed legislation in California. You may or may not recall this case as it broke open back in 2000, 4 years after he raped me, but it gained nationwide and worldwide media attention. It wasn't until that time that I learned I had been intentionally drugged and raped by him. I had no recollection of it because he had rendered me unconscious. The way it unfolded was that in July of 2000, I read in the local newspaper that he had been arrested for drugging and raping a young college student. The girl he raped remembered part of the attack and contacted the police. Thank God for her memory of it, or he would have continued to get away with this. His home was raided by police, who recovered dozens of videotapes, many containing the brutal acts he committed on his victims, including me. At that time, he had been stalking me for years, and I had a restraining order against him. I wanted to do anything to help the police, so I contacted them and went down to the Ventura County Sheriff's Office. When I got there, the detectives who had already obtained videotapes from his home of him raping numerous women recognized me as one of the victims in those tapes. They asked me if I could take a look at a paused portion of the tape and identify myself. What they showed me was the video on pause with me fully clothed, unconscious on his bed. He had drugged me using GHB, and then he raped and sodomized me while I was completely unconscious and videotaped the whole thing. He narrated the things he was doing to me for the camera and manipulated my body like a mannequin. He put a lit marijuana joint in my genital area and used a sword to act out a scene of him pretending to cut me. I noticed the outfit I was wearing in the beginning of the video was the outfit I wore on the very first night that I met him. Ultimately, I had to watch the entire video, and it was an absolutely horrifying experience. He narrated the video and said something to the effect of this feeling like Christmas time when he's about to unwrap his gift. I was married and pregnant with twins when I had learned about all this. I ended up losing one of my twins during my pregnancy. I blame it on the stress of learning about the horror of my rape. Unfortunately, even though there were so many videotapes of him raping unconscious women, those women do not have any recollection of what happened to them, so they have never come forward. Just like I never came forward because I didn't know. For him, it seemed like the perfect crime because no one ever knew about it. There was just the college student who reported it, and then me who came forward, and then there was one other woman that had some recollection of the rape, snippets of it. She was found when detectives began calling women in his little black book. Unfortunately, Barbara here was not able to testify, but was also discovered in his little black book, and police contacted her as well to tell her she had been raped by him. He was never charged for what he did to her. So there were only 3 of us that testified against him at the criminal trial. Our rapes were so heinous, so violent, that he was charged with 86 counts of rape just on the 3 of us. You can imagine just how bad those rapes were to get charged with 86 counts. Violent is the word. He was sentenced to 124 years in prison for what he did to us. We were all relieved that he would never get out of prison and never be able to do this to any other woman ever again. After 10 years of incarceration, he was able to somehow get a resentencing hearing and had his sentence reduced to 50 years. That didn't scare me because at the time I thought 50 years meant 50 years and he'd be nearly 90 years old by the time he was released. But I was wrong. I did not know until just last year at his last parole hearing that he only has to serve half of that 50-year sentence because the rapes he committed are considered nonviolent offenses according to California law. Because of that, he is getting out 100 years early. He's scheduled to be released on Halloween 2026. How can anyone look at what he did to us and say it wasn't violent? On the tapes, you can hear that we were having difficulty breathing and we're making guttural sounds with our throats. There were expert witnesses who were doctors that testified during the criminal trial who said our airways were obstructed due to the extreme anesthesia, and we were fortunate to have survived. This monster was up for early parole in December 2022. He's up for early parole again on August 8th this year. He has that right according to Proposition 57, since his crimes are considered nonviolent. I can't tell you how hurtful that is to us as survivors. Andrew Lester, in our opinion, will resume drugging and raping women as soon as he is released. Even after he was arrested and the criminal trial was underway, he fled the country to escape the legal implications. When he was captured in Mexico by Dog the Bounty Hunter, the FBI found GHB and a video camera on a tripod in his motel room. So it looks like he was at it again, drugging and raping women and videotaping his crimes. This is a true violent criminal who has committed dozens of violent rapes and who is about to be rewarded for good behavior by being let out of prison early, because the law says that what he did to us isn't violent, but I can tell you, if you ask any Californian, they would be appalled that our law would allow this. We stand before you to ask you this, to please change this now. You have the power to do this. Thank you.
I don't often found myself a lack of words. But it's these stories and so many others that are still untold that continue to underscore the importance of this Senate bill and to change the rape culture here in California. I'd like to invite our treasurer, Fiona Ma, to come to the microphone and just share a bit about how she has been a champion for women here in California and an ally to me as well, to be able to bring some of this most needed legislation forward. Treasurer Ma.
Thank you, Senator Alvarado Gil, and all the folks here in support. When I was in the legislature from 2006 to 2012, I was chair of the Select Committee on Domestic Violence, and I also served on the Public Safety Committee for 3 years. The fact that this is not a violent crime is very, very shocking. And to hear the survivors tell their story, thank you for being brave and being willing to speak up for so many that probably can't because they don't remember or they face so much shame. And so I just thank the senator for carrying this bill and for all the supporters. We really desperately need to change this law. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the men and women in law enforcement who put the uniform on and are oftentimes the first to encounter the crime scenes and have to have those conversations with victims about what has happened to their bodies and collect evidence and use that to put forward a prosecution, a case, knowing that the laws are not in our favor. I want to thank the district attorneys and the deputy district attorneys and their staff for taking on the cases of sexual assault, even if it is a very difficult uphill battle because of the inadequacies of our laws. I know for the past 20 years, our law enforcement community and our prosecutors have attempted to do everything that they can, but we need to do our part as California legislators. Let this be the last decade that we have to come in front of cameras, live stream to all of America and talk about a rape culture that protects criminals, protects perpetrators, allows them to reoffend, and to create numerous more survivors that will carry the trauma for the rest of their lives. This is a generational issue. This is about our daughters, our sons,